Goldenrod is the beloved medicinal and dye plant with the genus name Solidago. There are over 100 species in North America alone, and most can be used more or less interchangeably. The plants are easy to identify because of their large, pyramid-shaped clusters of brilliant gold blooms, often visible along roadsides. As you can see here, I'm snipping the plant in about the middle of the shaft of the stem, and you can see some of those clusters of blooms up close here.
Okay, so we're going to discuss really quickly some of the materials that you'll need to get started with natural dyes. I want to stress there is absolutely no need for breaking the bank when it comes to your dye practice. It can be super affordable, it should be affordable. You can totally do this without breaking the bank, I promise you. So, a couple things you're going to need to get started. A dye pot of some kind. The dye pot needs to be made out of something like stainless steel, a coated enamel, aluminum, a non-reactive metal. It can't be made of copper, it can't be made of iron, it needs to be made of something like stainless steel. So I have one here, this is a large one, a stainless steel pot. I've also got a small one here as well. And so you'll want a pot that whatever you're dyeing, if it's small pieces of thread, if it's pieces of clothing, you want your dye pot to enable those things to float freely in them. So if you're dyeing a lot of stuff, big pot, little stuff, small pot. You also will need your dye stuff itself. I have some goldenrod right here, which you can see. I've already started processing it, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You're also going to need a mordant, and we're going to discuss mordants in great detail in just a minute, but there's two mordants we'll be dealing with, one for protein fibers and one for cellulose fibers. And so I've got aluminum sulfate and I have aluminum acetate. Aluminum acetate is going to be for cellulose fibers, for plant-based fibers, and aluminum sulfate is going to be for protein fibers, for those animal-based fibers. So in addition to that, I also have my fiber. Fiber is just going to be whatever it is that you're going to be dyeing. So for me, I've got some linen fabric here. That's going to be my cellulose or plant-based fiber. And I also have some silk thread, but natural dyes do work best with natural fiber. So you will want to identify what kind of fiber you're dyeing and make sure that it is a natural fiber. I've also got a couple other things, assorted kitchen things like slotted spoons. I have a sieve, I have a little strainer here. It's going to make things easier to remove later on. I do want to stress that if you don't have all these things immediately, that's going to be okay. Dyeing will grow as you grow, and you'll just pick up things as you see them in the stores throughout the rest of the time you spend dyeing. I also have a little kitchen scale here. It's important to have some way of measuring both your fiber and your mordant. So this is just a little kitchen scale, or a post office scale will be just fine. And you're going to need a heat source of some kind. So I have just a portable burner, a plug-in burner. It could be your kitchen stove. It could be a fire you have outside. Anything that you have relative control over the heat with and that you can use safely. And that's really all you need to get started with natural dyeing. We're going to talk about scouring and warranting and things like that soon. But don't stress too much about having to get the perfect tools to get started. I encourage you to start wherever you are and use whatever you have before you go out and invest too much in a new hobby like this. So I wanted to say a quick word about scouring before we talked about mordanting. So scouring is really just a fancy textile word for cleaning your fiber prior to mordanting and dyeing. Scouring helps remove some of that dirt and grease that fibers can accumulate either during manufacturing or during transit, things like sizing, things like starch, or things like dirt and grime. This extra step can help dye adhere to your fiber much better. Some very used items, honestly, don't always need to be scoured. I often dye vintage things that have been washed many times, so a hot wash in the washing machine will be fine for some of those things, but for brand new fibers and some really dirty fibers, you may need more assistance in getting those things clean. If your fiber needs scouring, it's very easy to do. You'll need a pH neutral soap of some kind. Things like Eucalan, things like Dr. Bronner's, Orvis paste are all great. I personally like to use just plain soda ash. It's inexpensive and pretty easy to find. You also can find specially made fiber scour from natural dye suppliers as well. All you'll have to do is weigh your fiber and then find 3% of that weight. If your fiber feels extra dirty, you can increase that even to 5% if you want to. So you'll measure your fiber, find 3% of that weight, and then measure out that much of your detergent, whatever that 3% was. So if it's 10 grams, if it's 3 grams, 5 grams, weigh that much soda ash, Dr. Bronner's, whatever your detergent is gonna be. Dissolve that detergent in a small pot. You could use something like this probably pretty easily for small things, or a bigger pot for something else. Raise that temperature to about 180 degrees. Add your fiber to that scouring water, that detergent water. Let it simmer for about an hour or so. After about an hour, you'll see the water much different, darker color. Or you can remove your fiber then, and then you can proceed to mordanting after that. So when it comes to creating long-lasting natural color on fiber, in my opinion, mordanting is without question the most important process. Mordanting is something that you do to fiber before dyeing that helps the fiber bind more regularly to natural material. For the most part, we use what are called mineral salts for mordanting. So we're gonna use things like alum, which is I have in a jar right here. We're gonna use two different kinds of alum depending on what kind of protein fiber or cellulose fiber you're using. And you also can find natural fibers in the world as well. There are great tannins, really great natural sources for mordanting. However, I think when you're first starting out, it's much easier just to start off with something you can measure and you can find really easily. So I recommend starting off with alum and getting more adventurous as you go. So for protein fibers, we're gonna be using aluminum sulfate. And for cellulose fibers, we're gonna be using aluminum acetate and then calcium carbonate or wheat bran. I'm gonna explain these two things in detail to you now, but don't ever skimp on mordanting. I find that people, if they have issues at the end of their dyeing process with their color or with anything at all, it often can be traced back to an improper mordanting job. So please don't forget to mordant your fabric before dyeing with Goldenrod.
Mordanting cellulose fibers is very easy. You're going to need 10% weight of fiber. I have that pre-measured here, and this is aluminum acetate. I'll take 10% weight of fiber, which for me is 10 grams, and dissolve it in hot water in this boiler here. You want it to dissolve in that water and have a heat-safe container close by. As long as you have sink hot water, you won't need a heat source for mordanting cellulose fibers, as sink hot water is plenty hot to do the job. Add your mordant and water solution to your heat-safe container sink hot water. Stir to combine. And make sure your container is large enough for your fabric that you're mordanting to swim freely. I'll add my fabric in now. And you want to make sure there are no puckers and that things are able to float freely in the dye bath. You'll leave this to sit for at least 45 minutes, turning occasionally to make sure things are being absorbed evenly. After it's been sitting for 45 minutes, you'll repeat this process in a similar way using either calcium carbonate or wheat bran at 5% weight of fiber. Dissolve either substance in hot water just like you did with the alum and apply it to the fiber after it's been mordanted. After this, you can rinse lightly and hang to dry and proceed to dyeing. Mordanting protein fibers is going to be very similar to mordanting cellulose fibers. You'll just need more heat. For mordanting protein fibers, we'll be using 12% weight of fiber. I have that pre-measured in this bowl here. We're going to be using aluminum sulfate for mordanting our protein fibers. I'm mordanting some small skeins of silk thread here, so I'm able to use kind of a small boiler for my mordanting. If you're doing larger pieces of fabric or clothing, you may need to use a larger container. I've already dissolved my 12% weight of fiber alum in my dye pot, and now I'm going to add my fiber, allowing it to fully submerge and really soak up that alum solution. If you're using a piece of fabric, you want to make sure there are no puckers. You want to make sure things are being evenly submerged. After things are evenly submerged, you want to raise the temperature to about 180 degrees. It doesn't have to be exact. You don't have to use your thermometer. It's just right before a simmer, when the water is just barely beginning to shiver. You don't want to boil your fiber. Allow it to simmer for about 45 minutes, occasionally rotating the fabric to allow for even absorption. After at least 45 minutes, you want to remove the fiber from water, allow it to cool slightly, and then squeeze to remove any excess liquid. Rinse gently in water of about the same temperature, and you can proceed to dyeing.
Let's talk about how to process your goldenrod and get it ready for use in dyeing. So I picked this morning, and I could use it now for dyeing if I wanted to, but maybe you come across some goldenrod on a trip or when you're driving around somewhere, or you see it in a park somewhere, and you don't have time to dye with it immediately. You can pick it then and then dry it and save it for later. I'm gonna show you how to get things ready for drying as well. So I've got a pretty big stem right here. You can see this has these really beautiful gold plumes up top, these really beautiful flowers. And I have these kind of long stems down here with no flowers on them. So I like to strip all the leaves off of that long stem down here. And it's really easy to do that for goldenrod. Just kind of clasp right here with your fingers. And if you just pull down like this, you can see how easily you can just strip those leaves off of that down there. You're not going to be using the leaves for dyeing, you're just going to be using the flowers. So it's just a little bit less messy to clean all these off now before you start drying your flowers. So I'm going to trim the leaves off of several stems here. And I do find that you do lose a little bit of potency when you're using dried goldenrod versus fresh goldenrod. So if you're planning on using some dried goldenrod, you may want to get extra. So I usually find you may have to increase by about 20% or so with dried goldenrod. But it works really beautifully for dyeing as well. So I've got this one here. I'm just gonna, again, just strip those leaves off like that. I'm gonna hang them to dry upside down like this. I like to use rubber bands to bind my stems together. I find that over time, oftentimes these woody stems, when they dry, shrink slightly. And if you use just twine, the twine won't contract like a band will. And so oftentimes the flowers kind of fall through the twine you might tie around them. So I like to just put my rubber band around one stem, just like this, and then just wrap my band around like this several times. I find you can get much tighter bands that way versus having to keep kind of doubling it over on itself like that. I can hang this up to dry at direct sunlight, and in a couple of days really, it dries really quickly for the most part. I'll have some really beautiful dried goldenrod. When it comes to dyeing with goldenrod and really with any forest material, you really want to isolate the part that you get the dye from. So with goldenrod, it's really these, beautiful little plumes of golden flowers at the top of the flowers here. So when you're making your dye solution, you want to get as a high concentration of those golden parts as possible. And so to do that, I like to take the kind of larger woody stems like this and take all of these little plumes off of the stem. If you get less of that kind of woody green material, like the stems here and the leaves, I find you get a much more pure kind of golden color.
Now we're going to get ready for an overnight soak. I'm a really big fan of soaking dye material overnight beforehand to give it a little bit of a head start and get it really ready for dyeing the next day. It kind of speeds things up a little bit and helps open up the plant fiber and just helps coax the color out more quickly. What I have here is 200 grams of goldenrod. I'm dyeing about 200 grams of fiber, and so you really want to aim for at least a 1-to-1 ratio of dye stuff to fiber. I often will push that even further and have maybe even 250% dye stuff versus fiber for a really punchy, bold color. I'm going to add in my processed goldenrod to my dye pot. That's about half full of sink hot water. There's enough water in here for what I'm dyeing to flow freely. I'm just going to kind of coax that goldenrod and really help it break up a little bit, help it get ready to release that dye into the liquid. You can even add more into it if you need to. You can see me adding more fresh goldenrod flowers to this now. And I'm going to let this sit overnight and let it soak. When I come back tomorrow, I'm going to have a nice, beautiful golden head start on coaxing the color out of this dye material. If you think you might be leaving it for longer than a day or so, you can add a couple of cloves or a little bit of spearmint oil, and it'll help prevent mold from forming on your dye liquid.
So I have my fiber mordanting, I've got my goldenrod processed and soaking over here, and I'm almost ready to start my dyeing. So I'm gonna let all these things soak for the appropriate amount of times, and then we'll regroup all together for the workshop, and we'll get things get things going then. We're going to discuss different ways of dyeing, talking about immersion dyeing here. I'm also going to show you some cool ways of bundle dyeing, or more into fabric as well, and also discuss more of forging as a creative practice and talk about some forgers in history as well. So I'm excited to do all of this with you all later on, and I hope that you have lots of luck finding your goldenrod and lots of fun time spent by yourself processing this stuff and getting ready for the dyeing to happen. I'll see you all soon.